It's such a pleasure to be here. The challenge we're going to have is trying to use this time. We have a little bit of time with a lot of content, and we want to make sure that what we present is directly relevant to your work, so that it helps you in advancing your work. So Jeff, I think, framed the issues extremely well. That is, what is equity? Why does it matter? How does it show up? And so that helps me because I don't have to spend a lot of time doing it, right? I will just add, and it's already, I think, clear in what Jeff said, that it's about giving kids what they need, both academically and in terms of the social, the emotional, the psychological. You can't separate them. They're the same person. Which kids do the least well? The kids with the greatest needs. Which kids do we punish the most? The kids with the greatest needs. And all you have to do is look at it. We are punishing kids because of their needs, because we haven't met their needs. We're identifying the behaviors, the things they did wrong. We're not addressing the causes. Right? And so if we're going to change outcomes, we have to change the way we approach the work. Right? And so figuring out how to do that is going to be hard because many of us have been doing this work for a long time. And we're accustomed to certain ways of operating. And the ways we've operated have produced these unequal outcomes. So part of what, and Jeff left with this, a paradigm shift means that you got to shift the whole way you think about it. You can't get different results if you have the same approach. The same approach is taking us to where we are now. Right? So rethinking that approach, that's why it's so hard. And so we're going to give you some examples of how other schools are doing that. Because the good news is work's being done. And the good news is they're not waiting for the politicians, right, to give them permission or to give them the guidance. Because guess what? It's not coming. Right? If you're waiting for help, if you're waiting for the right president, the right governor, guess what? It's not happening. The leadership has to happen in your district, in your schools, right, if there's going to be any kind of change. We do have to be focused on outcomes, but outcomes are not the same as test scores. Bigger than test scores. Think about the outcomes that matter to you as parents. Are you fixated on what test scores your kids get? Or are you thinking about the kind of character? Whether or not your children are happy, whether or not your children are productive and independent. Even if they don't get good grades, if they are happy, productive people, are we satisfied? If they get good grades, but they are depressed or strung out on drugs, are we satisfied? We got to think about this in a more complex, but in a more holistic manner as well. Problem with many people, many districts who are trying to do this work is they're stuck. They're stuck in old ways of doing things. I was talking to a district over here, I won't call them out, about the challenge of addressing tracking, right? We know that tracking is a way of trapping certain kids. Which kids do we track low? Again, poor kids, kids of color, kids who don't speak English. But we not only track kids, we track teachers. Right? Which kids are teaching those kids? Usually the least experienced, least effective. Wow, show me the research to support that strategy. But changing that is not just about altering the schedule. That's a technocratic solution applied to a more substantive problem. Because if you don't change the teaching, nothing's going to change. Because the teachers who've been teaching the advanced kids will resent teaching the other kids. And they'll set them up for failure. You actually have to change the way they're taught. You have to change the whole dynamics in the classroom. So Fontana High School, 4,000 kids in Southern California, all Latino, all poor, highest AP calculus scores in the county. I was curious how they do it. I asked the principal, he said, well, let me introduce you to our calculus teacher. Takes me to meet the AP. He said, this teacher's great. I said, how did you do it? He said, well, I only had 6 kids 4 years ago in AP calculus because that's all they were producing. So I decided I had to start teaching 9th grade math because I had to build the road to calculus. I had to show other math teachers we don't avoid teaching 9th grade math, we share it. High quality teachers, highly effective teachers produce better results for all kinds of kids. You know, if the only kids you can teach well are the kids who don't need much help, you're not that good, right? Right? That's like if I'm a doctor, but I can only help healthy people, right? I'm not that good if that's the only kind of people I can help, right? So we want value added. We want evidence-based instruction. We want a focus on how to meet the needs of kids. And so what we've got to do is promote internal accountability, right? That is, we've fixated on being accountable to the state, being accountable to the superintendent, the board. External accountability is weak. It's weak because they're just looking at the data. Right? Internal accountability, when we're accountable to each other, it changes the character of our discussions. Because now we have frank, honest discussions about what's going on in your classroom. And how come you're teaching 7th grade and I teach 8th grade and your kids can't write? Because I see them in my class. If we can't have an honest conversation about that, nothing's going to change. It's the willingness to be honest with each other about our work, not to blame, not to point fingers, because we confuse accountability with blame, with pressure. Pressure is not a strategy for improvement. You can't threaten people into improving. They actually have to know what they're doing and know what they're doing wrong and know what to do differently. So internal accountability. Richard Elmore says when you can promote a sense of internal accountability in schools, schools move because they start working together as a team. Because they're all focused on the same things. They start to share certain practices and they can have honest, reasonable conversations with shared vulnerability. Write that word down. Phrase. Shared vulnerability. That means that we all are honest. We're talking about our work together. We're not there to point fingers, but we are there to say, look, this is where I'm struggling. And I can see it because what the kids can do is a reflection of how I teach. Is that a radical idea? Right? That is, we got to stop expecting kids to learn the way we teach. We've got to start teaching kids the way they actually learn. When we shift that conversation and we start taking ownership because we see teaching and learning as connected activities, not as disconnected, because we often think of teaching as something we do to kids, not with them. When we start to see it as relational, then we take much greater ownership for outcomes. I can't tell you often I go to a district where the kids are struggling and the teachers act like they had nothing to do with it. Because they're too busy blaming the parents, blaming the kids. And I can't tell you often I go to school districts where the superintendents and the principals are simply blaming the teachers, as if they had nothing to do with it. Blame is not a strategy that works. So how do we make sure the conditions that are necessary for good teaching are in place? That's the work we should be focused on. And I can tell you right now, I'm in so many schools, I can tell within 5 minutes if it's a good place to work and learn. I can tell by how I'm treated by the receptionist. I can tell by the way kids carry themselves in the hallway. I can certainly tell by what's going on in the classroom. So we need to be attentive to that. We need to be focused on recognizing, and I think Jeff made the case already, this achievement gap we say we're so focused on is really about inequality. That's what it's about. Right? It's an educational manifestation of inequality. We've known for the longest time the strongest predictor for how well a student does in school is family income. When you combine family income with how much education the parents had, especially the mother, you can predict with great consistency who will be your high achievers and who will be your low achievers. How do you disrupt that? Now let me ask a question. How many of you come from a family where neither parent graduated from college? Raise your hand. Lots of folks. How many come from a family where neither parent graduated high school? Still a few hands. Mine too. Neither parent graduated high school. Father got his GED. They sent all 6 of us to college, some of the best colleges in the country. Living proof, your background should not predict your outcomes. Ask yourself now, when I look at AP classes, honors class, gifted classes, how often do I see kids from low-income backgrounds, from immigrant families, foster care? If they're not there, the problem is in your school, not in the children. Schools have to be focused on developing talent in children, not in measuring and sorting. Understand the difference? Measuring and sorting is what we've been doing. We identify you're gifted, you're going to get this nice gifted teacher. Sorry. You're going to get the nice, brand new slow teacher. Okay? And wow, pretty predictive. Because usually the kids we identify as slow early, they stay slow. Right? They stay slow. Because we're not cultivating talents and strengths. What we're doing is we're making judgments about kids that become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And you know what? The gifts, I don't mean to burst your bubble, but most of her gifts come from having had well-educated parents who had a lot of time. That's the gift. Right? And that's great if you've got that. But guess what? Not everybody does. I'd like to point out to my wife, who graduated from Hunter in New York, a school for the gifted. You have to test in at 4. She's very proud of having graduated. And I said, I go occasionally with the alumni gatherings and see all the other formerly gifted people. Right? I say formerly gifted because right now they're just ordinary people. I said, what happened to the gifts? The gifts disappeared. They're just like dentists and sell insurance. I mean, there's a few that have stuck out. Lin-Manuel Miranda, the producer, director, star of Hamilton in the Heights, he's gifted. He comes from Washington Heights. You know how many kids are from Washington Heights now, or from Harlem, or at Hunter? No, I'm from Brownsville. Okay, so we got a lot in common. But if you look at these gifted schools, they're not serving poor kids. They're not serving black kids. They're not serving Dominican kids. So they go to celebrate, wow, one of ours is made Hamilton, but guess what? They don't serve those kids anymore. Right now, they only serve the most affluent kids. So something's wrong with the way we're doing this. We're not using schools to expand opportunity, to break the cycle of poverty. We're using schools to reproduce it, reproduce inequality. And that's a major indictment on what we do. And so a big part of what we have to look at is we have to look at the ways in which we reward privilege and punish the disadvantage. Because that's the other side of equity. It's the way inequity gets imprinted. Think about how many of your kids who are in special ed right now, for whom you have an IEP. If we were doing it right, everybody should want an IEP, right? Okay. Who wouldn't want an individualized plan for their child? Except that we know that many of the children are there because they're suffering from something called ABT. Ain't been taught. That's what they're suffering from. And not being taught will produce a disability, will produce kids who no longer believe they can learn because they've not been stimulated, they've not been challenged. Right? And so we've got to be willing to look at the evidence, look at the data, ask ourselves tough questions. I can't tell you how often do you go to schools where we are suspending kids who don't like school. Sending them home to watch TV. You say, oh, you've been acting up. Go home and play video games for 3 days. Let's see if that fixes you. I was in Cleveland talking to the principal. The student comes in, he says, you've been cutting. He says, yeah. He says, you get 3 days suspension. Boy says, give me 5 days this time. He says, okay, smart aleck, you get 5 days. He walks out. I said, do you think that's going to change anything? He said, no, but it's going to get him out of my hair for 5 days. So are we using discipline to change behavior or to get rid of kids we don't want to serve? Right? Those are the kind of honest questions we have to ask ourselves. If you're changing behavior, you know what it looks like? You're not punishing the same kids over and over and again because the behavior changes. Lawrence Kohlberg, writing about moral development in children and moral development, character development has to be part of discipline. He said the goal of discipline is not to teach kids to avoid punishment. It's to teach kids to do what's right even when we're not looking. Wow, think about that as a standard. So we need to make sure that in every aspect of the school, from teacher assignment to discipline to special ed to homework is an equity issue, isn't it? You ever see some kids that bring in that paper, looks like a lawyer worked on it? And you know very well Dad is a lawyer. How many of you spend hours working on homework with your kids? Science projects, right? And how many of you know you have students right now that have no one to help them with homework? Don't speak the language, have no place to do homework, just lost their home. Do we take that into account? or do we penalize them for what they don't have? Equity can't just be a slogan. We've lived with slogans. No Child Behind was a great slogan, wasn't it? You know the problem is the Department of Education thought it was just a branding problem. They thought Race for the Top would be that was a better slogan. Right? They didn't understand fundamentally what was wrong with the approach. Marian Wright Edelman, who came up with the slogan, Leave No Child Behind, she understood it meant something different. It meant focusing on health and nutrition and all those things that Jeff talked about, that Maslow talked about. Somehow that wasn't part of the strategy. So we need to really rethink what we're doing. We need to challenge the beliefs, the way certain patterns become normalized and complacency sets in. If you're in a system, we are accustomed to seeing kids fail. We're accustomed to not seeing poor kids excel or immigrant kids in your advanced place and doing great things. Then you don't feel troubled by it after a while. That's just the way it is. And so what we got to do is challenge the beliefs. Challenge the notion that it's parents driving the outcomes and not us who have to take responsibility as educators for changing the outcomes. If we can't challenge the beliefs, we won't change the outcomes. That's the starting point. Because if you don't believe they can do it, if you don't believe it can be done, if you believe it's in their culture that's holding them back or their genes, guess what? I don't care how much professional development you do, nothing will change. We have not addressed the beliefs that drive the outcomes. You've got to be willing, as the leaders who will come into these conferences, to go back and challenge each other respectfully. Right? To disrupt it. And I know that sometimes people say, this is painful, people don't like me anymore. Well, you got to be willing to be disruptive. Okay? I was doing a workshop like this for principals at a very affluent district in New Jersey. I said, some kids are being blatantly denied the opportunity to learn. Principal raised his hand. He said, I've seen some examples of it in my school. I said, why don't you share? He said, well, I'm new here. And so I wasn't accustomed to the idea of black boys just roaming the hallway during class. But everybody at the school seemed to be accustomed with it. So I decided I was going to do something about it. I told them they had to go to class. So I started escorting them to class. And that's when I learned they were all going to class in the basement. Right? Because that's where our special ed classes were held. And then I went down to the basement. I saw there was no learning going on at all. They were just playing. And I also learned about the stigma of being one of the kids in the basement, because that's where the dumb kids were. He said, I think it's time to get them out of the basement. I said, well, that's a good idea. But when he said that, people looked away, because they'd been in the basement for years. Everybody knew they were in the basement. That wasn't a new development. So my question to you is, who's in your basement? Who's in that classroom? You know very well, right now, the teacher can't teach them. She needs medication of some kind to calm herself. Who's in that bungalow out back, right? Because in so many schools, it's blatant the way we set people up. It's so obvious. And the only thing that I have to ask is, how come I can see it as a visitor and no one here has seen it? No one here is willing to do anything about it. So we can't just pretend and fake our ways through. The framework for equity is rooted in things we've known. And Jeff has alluded to a lot of this. It's rooted in child development, understanding that there's a spectrum at which kids do things, a spectrum at which kids will walk, will talk, will read, right? Any pediatrician will tell you that. There's not a single standard, right? Being an early walker doesn't mean you're going to be a sprinter, right? But if we're focused on child development, then we are giving kids what they need to develop rather than making judgments early about them. The neuroscience reminds us now, reinforces the idea, the brain is elastic, it's like a muscle. It has to be worked for everybody. That means all kids have to be stimulated. All kids have to be challenged. Right? And lastly, we got to understand the context. What's going on in the family? What's going on in the home? Some kids are going to need more because they're getting less. Right? So I don't want to pretend it's easy, but you do need to understand, if you're going to do equity, it starts by knowing who the kids are. How do your kids learn when they're not with you? Chances are it's not this way. Chances are they don't get a presentation or a lecture first. Most of our kids learn by doing, not by listening. Most of our kids learn through their mistakes. You have a classroom where it's safe to make mistakes. And most kids, when they really learn something like a new video game or how to cook or how to fish, learn through mastery. Right? Wow. How many of our kids can say, I mastered the timetables. I'm ready for long division. I mastered that book. I'm ready for something more advanced. If you don't experience mastery, what happens? You have a weak foundation. You can't do the more advanced work. When you focus on real evidence of learning, you teach differently and you work with children very differently than we typically see. As Amelia said, we'll know it's working when the backgrounds of our kids aren't driving the outcomes. That's how we'll know. When you can't look in a classroom and tell which one is for the advanced and which one is for the remedial. Guess what? How many of you know wealthy kids who are not that bright? I know a whole lot of them that are lazy, they got other issues, right? But guess what the research shows? A wealthy kid who is mediocre is more likely to graduate from college than a poor kid who's advanced. Oh, 10 minutes. I better go faster. All right. So I don't have time to talk about technical adaptive work, but be aware of it. The technical work is all about compliance. The adaptive work is about how to inspire, how to engage. That's the work we got to make time for, okay? So what does it look like when we bring it all together? Well, the schools that are making the most progress are actually doing things the research shows works. They've got all these five. These five are the essential characteristics that the research identifies as leading to sustained improvement. Coherent instructional guidance system means teachers aren't doing their own thing. Ongoing development of the professional capacity of the staff. Here's another key. The skills of the staff have to match the needs of the kids. That's the gap you've got to close. If the kids can't write, it means the teachers don't know how to teach writing to them. Pretty simple, right? Third, strong parent-community ties. Matters. Trust. Reciprocity. Fourth, a student-centered learning climate where kids think it's cool to be smart. Right? And cultures can't be imposed on schools, they have to develop organically. And fifth, shared leadership. It's not about a savior coming in. Everyone, teachers have to be leaders, a custodian can be a leader, receptionist got to be a leader, she's the first person to interact with parents. Everyone has to understand their role. So, what does it look like? Here's one example, Brockton High School, Massachusetts, the largest high school in the state, 4,200 kids. Okay. They decided back in 1998, when the state was about to implement their high-stakes exams, that test prep wouldn't do it. Test prep wouldn't do it, so veteran teachers went to the principal and said, the only way we can succeed on this assessment is if every teacher becomes a teacher of literacy. Principal says, great idea, but I can't make the teachers do it. So we'll work with the willing. We don't have to wait till everybody's ready. Right? Work with the willing first. Right? Secondly, they said, well, I can't pay you. They said, we'll work on our own time. Heavily unionized district, teachers working on their own time, helping each other. Differentiated professional development. What a radical idea. Not all teachers need the same thing. Because literacy in science doesn't look the same thing as literacy in PE. Right? They start in 1998, they stick with it. 2002, 50% of the kids passed the test. The most rigorous exam in the United States, in Massachusetts, highest performing state. Say, oh, literacy works, let's stick with it. 2006, 80% of the kids passed the test. Since 2010, over 90% of the kids passed Massachusetts state assessment. Over 1/3 of the senior class gets the highest possible score. These are the scholarship winners from 2015. And guess what? The demographics of the kids who pass the test and get the free scholarship to any public university match the demographics of the school. This is a district where 90% of the kids of color, 60% of the kids, English language learners, 100% of the kids, low income. Now, if you Google Brockton, you will see they had a brawl at their graduation 2 years ago. They were fighting. You know why? Because they're known for fighting in Brockton. They're a fighting school. They got a boxer out front. This is Rocky Marciano's town. Okay? But they're also known for writing in Brockton. Sue Satchowitz, the principal, retired. 3 years ago, she contacted me and said, Pedro, I'm leaving. I didn't need to warn you because you send people to look at the school, they won't find me. I said, are you worried? She said, not at all, because the teachers own this work, not me. And the schools continue to advance. Shared leadership, right? Not about a single person. Evidence-based. And when it all comes together and they stick with it, they didn't see literacy as a gimmick. Let's try that for 3 years and move on to something else. Now we'll get the iPads in. No, they stuck with it. Right? They stuck with it. That's one of the problems in schools. We keep changing what we're doing. We change so fast, people don't know what the hell they're doing. Here's another example, PS 28. I know there's a couple New Yorkers in there. We have fancy names for our schools in New York City. Right? Public School 28, out in Bed-Stuy. Highest scores in literacy and math in 2012. That's Sadie Silva in the picture. She contacted me yesterday. She's now training principals in New York. Glad to see that. What's the secret in PS 28? Where 30% of the kids are homeless. Where 25% of the kids have IEPs. Partnerships. The principal, Sadie, is the instructional leader. When I go visit the school, she introduced me to the secretary. She said, this is the person who does all the administrative work. I said, well, what do you do? She said, I'm the lead teacher. I'm in classrooms all day long. I'm working with the kids that teachers don't know how to serve. Going to classrooms, I find in every room 4 and 5 adults. I said, where are you getting all these teachers from? I said, well, they're not all teachers. Our special ed teachers are all in the classroom working with the teachers. The kids can't tell who's the real teacher because they work seamlessly together. So the others are parents we've trained to work with teachers. I said, do you pay the parents? They I have no money to pay them. I do train them. I see one parent, she's standing right next to a little boy. I said, why is she so close? I said, because she's there to keep him calm. And we're glad she's here. Because he's a handful. Parents are part of the strategy. And because this is a school that you would typically expect to see high turnover, high transience, right? Because they know they're getting a good thing, parents are willing to take an extra bus and get up even earlier to stay at the school, even after they move, because the school is meeting the needs of the kids. Extended day. Schools are open every night till 6 o'clock. That's when they get enrichment. That's when they get art. That's when they get robotics. They have a holistic framework and partnerships. So health needs met at school. Right? Job training, education for parents at the school site. Not done by the school, done by a job training agency. Because the principal knows if parents are employed and educated, they'll do a better job with their families. I met the guidance counselor. The principal warned me in advance. She said, I got him from the rubber room. Right? The New Yorkers know about the rubber room, right? That's where, a person could be sent, it's like the gulag for educators, right? You could be there for years playing checkers, right? And collecting a check. I said, how do you know to get this man from the rubber room? She said, I don't know why he was there in the first place, but he had been my counselor when I was in school. So I heard he was there. I asked for him because he had saved my life. They said, you could have him. So I go and I meet the counselor. He's talking to a little boy. I said, why are you here? He said, I'm here to learn how to be good. I said, is it working? He said, I hope so. Because I'm tired of being put out of class. And then they explain the school has a no suspension policy. Because they don't believe it's effective to send kids home. I describe these examples because all of them show us that when we operate with a more holistic framework, Jeff has developed a school, Roses in Concrete, that, as he said, is a lab school now for training teachers in Oakland. Because, here's the problem, and I say this as a person who teaches at the university. We are doing this work all wrong. We're training teachers in ways that don't prepare them for the schools they're going to be in. The gap between what they're learning at the university and what they actually experience is too wide. Right? And then we blame them because the districts, what do the districts do with them? The districts give them the hardest jobs. Right? They take the brand new people who are not master teachers and give them the hardest kids to teach. Show me the evidence that that'll ever work. It's not working. And so when we have a different framework that encompasses the kinds of ideas that you heard from Jeff, that focuses on teaching learning, but also extends learning, after school, summer school, Saturday school if need be. Some kids need more. Guess what? That's what middle class kids are getting. You think middle class, what are middle class kids doing in the summer? They're in camp. They're getting all kinds of enrichment. Poor kids are the ones. They're literally being denied thousands of hours in learning opportunities because their parents can't afford it. We need to focus on safety, mentorship, community partnerships, right? Family engagement, health and nutrition. When it all comes together, outcomes start to change. They start to change. Abington, not far from here, is an example of a district that's been doing it. And you know the good news, if you look at the data in Abington, it's not just kids of color that have benefited from the change. White kids keep advancing. Right? Equity is not about just serving the disadvantaged. It's about serving everyone. It's about serving everyone. So don't get locked into this idea that if you do more for this one, it means I can't do something for that one. No. If you get there, you're not going anywhere because the most affluent parents will get you if they believe that's what you've done. They're watching you, aren't they? And many of them think equity is a dirty word. So you got to make sure that the strategy is excellence through equity. That's what we're aiming for. And we'll know if we're getting there if we can see it in the outcomes. Now, I'm out of time, but let me close with a short story. Because one of the things I didn't get to show you was this. This is a classroom in East LA, Hollenbeck Middle School. Look, it's a 90-minute algebra classroom. And those kids are up out of their seats. And the teacher's so good, she can stand in the back and talk to me. She doesn't have to hover. And because they're learning that way, they're not just learning math. What else are they learning? How to collaborate, how to respect each other, how to problem solve, impulse control. This is middle school. In a lot of middle school classes, when somebody farts, what happens? It's all over, right? Middle school, how many of you have taught middle school? Right? Middle school, learning has to be fun. Otherwise, what? They'll make it fun at your expense, right? So that's what this is. This is the highest form of classroom management. It's classroom management because the kids are academically engaged. These are all poor kids, all recent immigrants, all English language learners doing high-level math. Wow. She didn't start this way in September, did she? Why not? They weren't ready in September because no one's been teaching them that way. She had to do it in small bits and pieces, but by mid-October, they're ready. They're ready to take control of learning. Working at a school in Oakland, brand new teacher from Teach America comes to me and says, I need help with classroom management. I say, okay. She says, no one's willing to help me, so I come in to visit. Chaos in the room. Kids are screaming. She's screaming. It's painful to sit through. End of the class, I said, wow, this is terrible. She said, it's terrible like this every day. I can't take it. I leave with a migraine. She said, I'm about to quit. I said, don't quit. Let's go talk to the principal. Together we go to the principal. The principal says, you're a professional, deal with it. I say, listen, if you don't help her, she's going to quit. You'll have to get a sub for the rest of the year. He says, okay, I don't want that. He says, I have an idea. We have a veteran teacher who's just retired. She'll take over the room. I can only afford 2 days, but you can watch her. Veteran teacher comes. She's old school. She's not doing this. She doesn't know the kids, but she's serious business. And the kids can tell. They can tell when the real thing is here. So suddenly, kids that have been off task, they're on task. They're working. She's working the room. But at one point in the lesson, she hears two girls talking. So she stops what she's doing and says, young ladies, when I'm teaching, I want you to be quiet. She goes to write on the board, and under her breath, the girl says, bitch. But it wasn't a direct bitch. You know the difference? It was bitch down there. You could pretend it was a burp or a fart or something else. You could just let it go. But she's not letting it go. So she turns to the girl. She says, young lady, do I look like your mother? The whole class does that. They say, ooh. Brought mama into it. Girl says immediately, no, you don't look like my mother. She says, well, whenever you speak to me, I want you to think of your mother. And with that, goes back to the lesson. Girl goes back to work. Class doesn't miss a beat. New teacher turns to me and says, how did she know that that would work? That's your question. How did she know that that would work? What does the veteran teacher know that the new teacher doesn't? And where did she learn it? Equity is about how we engage our kids each and every day. Thank you.